Yes, good afternoon. Hi, everybody. I'm Ben. Thank you, Anouk. I think is it just lunch after me? So I'm going to have to be really quick, aren't I? Because you're not going to getting hungry at this point. So today, as Anouk said, I just want to speak to you a little bit about a specification called the Experience API, the xAPI, and how we've applied that specification for learning analytics, and a little bit of a look into the way that corporate training organizations are starting to take notice of what you guys are doing in learning analytics in education. My company, HG2 Labs, we get involved in funded projects like the Vital Project from time to time, but predominantly we work in the corporate world. So this would be a little bit of a crossover between the two. Learning Locker is a piece of software that we've released open source as a learning record store. It was what the Vital Project implemented, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but it is available to be installed wherever you wish for free under the GPL3 license. First of all, I need to go back in history to sort of talk to you about the Experience API and why I think it's important. So a lot of the time when we've looked at the results, the outcomes of learning interventions, we, especially in the corporate world, look at the end result, figures like how many people completed something, what the test score was. But we don't very often inspect the journey along the way. So we got involved with the Experience API specification a few years ago. This has come from the Department of Defense in the USA. The same department that previously came out with SCORM, which some of you may have been familiar with if you do e-learning at all. The idea of the Experience API was to get a more granular level of log about the learning experience, to understand not just the outcome, but the journey. And a couple of years ago, I was at a family gathering for Christmas in the UK, and we started to think about, not that we sit down and think about logs at Christmas for the family, we're not quite that dull, but nearly. But anyway, conversation turned to things like recording things, and my wife's dad went and got a logbook from up in the storage area of his house in the loft, and this logbook was from his father, so my wife's grandfather, Desmond Brown. And Desmond Brown in World War II trained to be a navigator on a heavy bomber in the RAF, and the RAF were sending people to Canada to train in around 1942, 1943. A lot of people went off to Canada to train. Now, Desmond Brown would go on to be an accountant, so he enjoyed keeping logs. He was very precise, and we got his book out, and this is just a few instances of his log being recorded, the time sequence, which is very similar to what Niels showed us earlier of some of the vital data. Now, there was a hidden agenda here because we knew there might be a coincidence, because my dad's dad, my grandfather, was a Halifax bomber pilot in World War II. And he was a little bit unusual because today, if you're a pilot in the RAF, you're usually a commissioned officer. You're a lieutenant, a captain, or something like that. But in World War II, they had a lot of non-commissioned officers. So he was actually Sergeant Betts. And he was a couple of years older than Desmond. And he completed his missions. He completed 30 missions and then was sent to Canada to train new people. And so we flicked through Desmond's book, and all of a sudden, there it was. On the 18th of July, 1943, Desmond Brown, my wife's grandfather, who I wouldn't meet for another 72 years, was trained by Harry Betts, Sergeant Betts, on the pilot there. And we thought it was, unfortunately, they're both dead now, so we could not ask them what went on that day and how it went. I imagine it was awkward because my wife's grandfather was an officer and Harry was not an officer, but he was in charge. It was his plane. But it was just a fascinating insight into the power of logs and the depth and the history that we can get from understanding people's journeys, not just from coming to the outcome. And so this really is my long-winded metaphor for the Experience API and the value of how we can collect standardized, normalized logs through a learning process to perhaps understand better what's occurred. Now, this is a big problem for us in the training world because nobody really measures return on investment on the training dollars that go into things, and billions is spent every year. 13% of companies, according to McKinsey, track the return on investment beyond participant feedback, which is generally about how good the food was. So we think about how can we help transform this experience, and we think about how we can adopt this specification, the experience API specification for systematically tracking data. And one of its big benefits is that we can get data from lots of different sources. The xAPI is just a spec, it's just a document, but using it, we can follow a recipe, as the Vital project did, to standardize the collection of data from many different sources. So in our xAPI world, we think about three things. We think about activity providers, sources of data. We think about a single source of record, a learning record store, a database in the middle. And we think about activity consumers, different aspects and systems that can consume the data from the system. So we see data coming in from online learning, from classroom learning, from performance indicators, from mobile devices, and increasingly from wearables. And all of this is being standardized in the learning record store to then be queried by a range of different tools. And some of those are analysis programs, a bit like the dashboards shown throughout the day. Some of them are more towards the quantified self movement. Some of them are towards credentials, things like there's a bit of crossover here into micro-credentialing, open badges, and things like this. How can we give some recognition of achievement for a small part of a program as well as the larger? And going off to other learning record stores, one of the problems that you may be familiar with if you've ever dealt with a learning management system is it's very hard to get out of a learning management system once you've got in. One of my big pieces, and one of the things that I thought it was important that Learning Locker was open source, was because I increasingly feel that data in its forms is going to become the lifeblood and the currency of how a university and how a business can differentiate its training from other people. So having ownership of that data becomes increasingly important. And having the ability to take the data and plug in lots of different systems and to move around is something that we haven't had for a lot of years. It's terribly painful to move from a system you already have. So I think one of the recognitions, if we listen to Neil from earlier in the day, thinking about the ways he thinks learning analytics is going to affect us all, I think my message is one of the core things we must do is not only understand how it's influencing students and how students can own their data, but making sure that our institutions have rights to their own data in the long term. So this is my ecosystem. We have a piece of software called Learning Locker, which is fundamentally the bit in the middle, which is, it's a database, which is fairly dull, but everybody needs databases, so, it's fine. There are three key functions of Learning Locker. One is to aggregate. This is to get all of this data from these different sources and validate it for the xAPI specification. Two is to automate tasks, which I'm going to come back to in a moment. And three is to help perform analysis. Now, as the Vital project found out, you can do some limited analysis in the Learning Record Store. But if you really are going to do some serious analysis, you're going to need to export this, take it out to a business intelligence tool, a statistical program, or something like that. So you can get limited analysis from the Learning Record Store. But realistically, the scope of a Learning Record Store is quite narrow. It's around the management of data, and the analysis usually goes on elsewhere. The automation is something that's increasingly interesting because as we see more and more research projects that find patterns and models, we see that there's potential for us to automatically trigger things based on the data we see coming in, a kind of if this happens, then make that happen routine. So we're increasingly interested in building business rule layers within a learning record store to mean that if we see something from the LMS, then we can push an email over here. If we see this person struggling, then how can we get the right revision topic to them? So there's a huge amount of work to be done here, I feel, in mapping some of the models and findings that people are creating into interventions, some of which may be fully automated, many of which will go via a tutor to begin with. So everybody is very welcome to go and try Learning Locker. We just released version 2 open source on Wednesday. I've been ensured that it is very, very simple to install. So the 3 steps are to put the kettle on, make a nice cup of tea, and then go to this URL. And everything will happen instantly, apparently. This short URL is actually another way in which we use xAPI. So you're familiar with things like tiny URL or bit.ly or things like that, shorten the URLs? So this is our URL shortener. Basically, I had to have a reason to use my Korean domain name. It seemed like a good idea at the time. That one's the South Korea. The North Korea one just doesn't work quite as well. The DRPK or whatever it is in the middle there. It's not so good. And it's also a little bit volatile. The South Korea one seems more placid. With that, we have a URL shortener, so it takes a big URL, makes it tiny, but it also spits out a statement to our learning record store. It's anonymous. We don't know who necessarily is clicking the link, but it gives us an interesting way to understand how people are using resources, maybe additional reading, things that you just throw out links for. Gives us a way to actually start tracking that in that sort of in that same format as everything else. So go to learnlocker/install, and you can get yourself a learning locker. The whole point of Learning Locker and where I'm going, where my business is going with this is to try and become a bit more proactive about things. Too often we find that we get dashboards and pretty reports and things like that, and it tells us what has happened, but gives us no opportunity to intervene in changing what has happened. And I think we're on this journey in the corporate space to try and become more proactive. And a lot of what I've heard talk about today is in that same sort of space, be it around student success or retention. How can we become a little bit more proactive in the learning analytics space? So in a horribly simplistic diagram, this is the way that I explain to some of the companies that we work with in terms of the stages that we need to move them through, of which we might not get through all of them, in order to make their systems more proactive. Because all of the companies that I talk to about their online training or their training in general, they all want to get straight to the end. They all want to make the perfect recommendation, the personalized thing. I want the Amazon tells me this and that and the other. But they never thought about the level of data or insight or rigor that is involved in moving from through those spaces. The reality is nearly everyone we speak to is down here. They just don't have systems that talk to each other fundamentally. So if we're trying to get the scale of data that we need to create slightly rigorous models, then we need to be working at a scale that most people are not, and we need to be connecting all of the different bits together. We've heard a lot, especially from the audience, questioning about bits of data in isolation, trying to get a more holistic view of things. But if we don't have a standardized way of doing that, then everything's going to be very difficult along the path. So most of the time when we go and speak to people, their first problem is getting stuff talking, because their ecosystems of how stuff comes together looks like a jumble of things. They have an LMS which has a grade book. We have the e-portfolio system. Actually, we got another LMS because the other one, the business school, didn't use the LMS, but now the LMS comes in. We get the grade book, the library, the knowledge place, the assessment. All of these things come together. Some of them have a single sign-on, some of them don't. Some of them are over here. This university lecturer prefers this one. So the first thing that we're trying to think about is how can we put this into a bit more order. And we have these sorts of pretty looking diagrams to say, look, this is how we can deal with this sort of routine. When we first started with the Experience API, it was 2013, 2014, and we had this very naive impression that a new specification had arrived, it would prove to be useful, and therefore everybody would do it without question. And that's not actually the way that adoption of specifications seems to work in the real world. And so whilst the Experience API has been quite popular in the USA, a bit in Europe, and with some learning tools, we see an ecosystem of maybe 150 to 200 systems that adopt the Experience API natively. So these systems enable you to output data in the xAPI format. They don't always do it very well, but they enable it in some way, shape, or form. There's obviously a lot more systems in our world than these 150 or 200. I think there's said to be over 1,000 learning management systems in the corporate space alone. So there are thousands of tools to be got here. And this is when we started to understand that actually we cannot wait for the world to become xAPI conformant. We're going to have to go to the world. So increasingly, we've been building more tools and pipelines and ETL processors that transform other systems' APIs, or even just flat files, CSVs, into the xAPI format. So we're now getting better and better at automating these processes and open sourcing the results. So using tools like Google Cloud has some good pipeline transformations and things like this that we can use to take data from an API that's in a sort of activity stream sort of format, the sort of someone did something sort of format, that log, and we can transpose it into the xAPI recipes that allow us to actually do all of this processing. We have other tools and things that we need to get to grips with, not least the idea of persona matching. So for some organizations that don't have a well-established single sign-on, how do we understand that this student is the same as this student? And how do we try and reconcile those sorts of layers? So that becomes a problem for the learning record store in our world, trying to reconcile multiple identifiers for the same person. Store the data on-premise, on cloud, locally, wherever you choose, and then look to push out, either to dashboards or to business intelligence type tools, or into those journeys, those business rules. But this is the sort of consistency we're trying to bring. And it doesn't mean you have to adopt xAPI, it just means that sooner or later we have to get it to it. I am a fan of the Experience API because I don't think there's a lot out there that really competes with it at the moment. But my fundamental message is not necessarily you must do xAPI. It's more about, for goodness sake, think about how you can standardize the collection of data from all of these different places. And the Experience API is one of the ways in which you might look to do it. So we've solved that problem. You'll notice that I come from the corporate world, so all the problems are instantly solved. No one has any issues with that. There are no questions. Carry on. So I've connected my data systems together, and now I'm interested in performing some sort of analysis. This is obviously a huge term to say the word learning analytics, and it's fairly meaningless, I believe, in this biggest term because it references so many possibilities. But let me take you through a couple. I was going to talk about Vital, but I'm not going to because other people have done it better, so I'll skip that and move on to a retailer, German retailer, called Willow & Bock. So these two examples I'm going to give you next are from the corporate world, of where we've started to try and apply some statistical analysis techniques to understand the impact of training on performance, on business performance. So Willow & Bock, you may have noticed if you look down in the bathroom next time you go somewhere, they make very nice bathrooms. They also do kitchenware and things like that. They've been around since 1748, so they're an old company of about 12,000 employees. And we've started to apply some data analytics techniques to understand whether their training programs are having any impact on performance. So specifically, these stats that I'm going to show you next take a look at a blended learning program that they call their brand ambassador program. It was about how they could sell more premium products in their stores. They are a premium brand, and that, for them, means that they have to get people invested in an emotional connection with Willow & Bock. They want people to feel special because they've got nice stuff. But that's a very different sell to selling plates as cheaply or quickly as you can. So they've gone through an extensive blended program, some face-to-face, some online, some synchronous, some asynchronous, some social, to try and see whether they can get more of their in-store people becoming what they would call brand ambassadors. So they have a measure, Net Promoter Score, that they use for customers to understand whether or not they are an ambassador for their brand. So we rolled out some training alongside them. Over the last couple of years we've been working with them, and this is still very much a work in progress. But they've got some interesting early results, which are starting to give us some indication that maybe we can go beyond happy sheets when it comes to training. So in this result, we have a sort of A/B test. Stores that did not participate in the blended learning program and stores that did participate in the blended learning program. And between them, we have data from average transaction values from 2016 and average transaction values from 2017. And we actually see, although both go up, we see that actually the difference in those stores that participated was significantly higher than those that did not. Now, the first thing that you will notice about this, other than their sort of vague colours of orange, and that could be better, is that we got to go beyond training data here. So we're aggregating huge amounts of training data in one place, but we also have the performance data on the other. These guys are unusual because they led us into xAPI. They led us into what they call their mystery shopper data to understand how people rate themselves in stores and things like that. And that's one of the variables that tends to be missing from most of the corporate stuff that we do. They don't let us into the actual performance data, which, you know, for us is a complete misnomer. We also start to inspect things like engagement in online training. So one of the factors that Vital looked at was the amount of activity that went on, and to see whether that might be a predicate of success or not. And we've done the same for Villeroy and Box to see whether those stores that were more engaged, and we've done this at the store level as opposed to the individual level, actually got better results than those that didn't. And again, we see some small trends in improved conversion rates. Those stores that participate the most in the top 10 of participation in online training. And when I say participation, it's a big catch-all from turning up at workshops to taking part in social learning activity. Compared to those that are in the bottom 10 of participation, we see a net difference of about 0.62% in conversion rate, which doesn't sound a lot, but it's 2.5 million euros, their average transaction value. Their average transaction value is about 55 euros a time. So.
You're at the university here. These are only measured values, but how significant is it? Maybe it's a statistical error.
Yeah, it could be. But what we're trying to do here is a bit more of a longitudinal study. So these are out of the first year's worth of data. But we don't know whether 2016 was a particularly great year. Well, we do have a view on 2016, actually. We know it was actually a fairly average year in the 200-year history of Villeroy and Boch, and the same with 2017. So we're doing this every month, and we'll keep doing it for the next 2 to 3 years to understand whether there are anything that's significant here, but to account for seasonal variation, to understand the market conditions and country to country. Exactly. So the randomization of the A/B test needs to be tested as well. So at certain points we have to understand that. There's a lot of variables here, some of which are not measurable, some of which we believe to be. So we're having a go at getting to this sort of routine. But you also have to remember that we're not in the academic world here. So these guys are desperate to get to something that gives some indication of whether training is worth anything at all. Because the other option here is to just not bother. And they could save significant amounts of money by not bothering. So we are constantly battling this sort of bit between the statistical significance of something and where we go with that. What we're trying to highlight at this point is areas that deserve deeper questioning and deeper investigation. We believe that these two areas, on the average transaction values and on the conversion rates, are worthy of us poking a little bit further and being even more rigorous in our next set of assessments, because it could be that our random A/B test ended up with a lot of stores in Estonia who sell nothing anyway, versus a lot of stores in Poland who are chucking out an awful lot of things. So we have to be really clear here. So you're quite right. So there you go, taking a longer-term view to understand the statistical significance of these things. So we've done similar things. Neil talked earlier about the different sorts of learning analytics. That was obviously very quantitative in nature. But we've also started to look at conversation. So Intercontinental Hotel Group, who I stayed at last night, they did quite well, although they charged my credit card twice. So maybe a little bit of learning to be done. We run massive open online courses on behalf of IHG. And specifically, the one that I'm going to reference here is talking about their first and second level leaders and how they have feedback conversations. They highlighted from various HR processes that they weren't having very productive appraisal conversations. First and second level leaders weren't very good at giving constructive, critical feedback to their reportees. So they put together a massive open online course over actually 5 weeks. There's a 5th week down there you can't quite see, to give them the opportunity to explore ways in which they could give feedback and to make it quite a social experience. So for each week, they started off with a synchronous activity and then carried on curating a bit of different sort of learning objects that they could work with. So some of the learning objects to be worked with were videos. Some were shot in-house. Some were curated from the web. Some of them were articles or self-made content, and others were these synchronous activities. And if you click on one of these, then we have the content. In this case, it's a video that's been shot in-house, and at the end of that video, there is a discussion question. So then folks come here and respond to the discussion question in line with the content. And we found this method, be it at the bottom or at the side, of sort of object-orientated discussion to be really quite productive when it comes to getting people contributing in a social learning environment, as opposed to having the content over here and the forum over here, where we tend to lose a lot of people in the middle. Doing this sort of one-to-one relationship of this seems to be quite productive. We also then get them to summarize at the end of each week with what we call an end-of-level gate, which is an open discussion question. You respond to the discussion question, and after you've made your response, you get to see everybody else's response. we get lots of traction for these things. So they had about 3,000 participants over the 5 weeks, and they had thousands and thousands of comments and contributions. This is usually where people stop at analyzing things in the corporate world. They sit there and say, hey, we had a lot of comments. Must be great. There can be no further proof. But we've started to push things, and Anouk mentioned earlier that I was into social and things like that. So one of the things that I was researching a few years ago was ideas like computer-supported collaborative learning and cognitive presence, and ideas of how we can use social to progress a learning conversation. So we've sort of taken a slightly hybrid, simplified model of cognitive presence, and we apply it to those end-of-level discussion questions. So not every comment and contribution, but the summary questions, where we're trying to understand using models that the data is flowing into xAPI, we're applying our models and then proving them back with hand-marked, human-marked data alongside it to see whether anybody's making any progression. So the sort of the bottom, the reds here, where we're getting these contributions that are people just, fundamentally restating the question or restating the obvious. The second level is where they're starting to explore a little bit. They're starting to ask questions about how they might do something differently or how things relate. And the final level is more reflective. We're seeing more and more folks that are becoming reflective of having seen a piece of content, having thought about how they might apply it, and having had a feedback conversation that's gone differently. So over the course of the first 4 weeks, we started to see that about 12% of our responses was coming in at that sort of level 3 in this case, of becoming more reflective as the case went by. So we're starting to get some evidence that's going a little bit beyond counting how many comments and contributions we had in a social environment. This sort of stuff will be familiar to folks who have worked in this area, but this is brand new information as far as a corporate training entity is concerned. So we're getting interested in these things. We're interested in getting data not just from the training systems, but also from performance systems to do more quantitative stats. And we're also getting more interested in how we can do some of this discourse analytics and apply it to the corporate world. The final step, of course, would be to become a little bit more model-orientated and start thinking about the future, which is where a lot of the conversation today has kind of landed. We aren't there yet, but we've had some interesting first examples of where we're starting to see this applied at scale. Actually, most of them do come from times where we've done education. So this is a portal we've done for an organization in the UK called City and Guilds. This is the Tech Bac. It's a technical baccalaureate. So you explore these different skill areas and complete content and conversations inside them, a similar model to the IHG one. And all of the data that comes in is filling up these bars. Your activity doesn't have to be on this platform to contribute to the progress because it's connected in this xAPI ecosystem. All of your activity, when it's connected via the database, can contribute to your progress. And then in this one, we started exploring the idea of tutor dashboards. This is tutor only. There is no student equivalent to this in this one, but starting to understand how we can benchmark cohorts against each other for a tutor's preference and insight. Our sort of performance quadrant was really benchmarked against measures that we considered to be those that were showing someone were engaged in a process. So not just were they logging on, but how much were they taking part in social activities and feeding back with each other versus actual progress in terms of how much progression they were making, and then benchmarking it against a cohort. This is the sort of stuff that then goes further with JISC, and you've heard about this a few times, but we're fundamentally involved in this JISC project in the UK to understand how we can improve student retention. And so what they're doing is establishing this marketplace environment whereby you can integrate all of these systems into what they call the student data warehouse. It's Learning Locker behind the scenes, but it's the student data warehouse. And then because we've standardized things, they're opening up the predictive elements to all of the providers and saying, guys, we've got a huge database that's got all of this data in a standard format. So if you integrate with us here, you'll make it very simple for institutions to be able to choose which one of you they want to go with and to chop and change the models they use. So down here, you'll see stuff from places like Tribal or Unicon, and a range of other predictive providers that tap into a centralized system. That centralized system can be hosted by JISC, or it can be done on premise as well. So we're starting to see a marketplace being established by these guys, and it's getting big. So in the last week, I got this off one of our monitoring tools. They've put in 40 million pieces of data in the last week into the student data warehouse. So we're now dealing with billions of pieces of data centrally into this format, all in the xAPI format, going out to these predictive tools, as well as the student app that Neil talked about and others. These are quite interesting times for us working on these sorts of projects, and we're really excited to see where they go. They start feeding the dashboards that you'll be familiar with, but the idea that I can chop and change, if I don't like Tribal's model, I can try somebody else's or apply my own, gives you a degree of flexibility perhaps you don't have. So, I think prediction will change everything for my business, because it means that we're no longer going to be interested in conversations where it's about, well, how many people have completed the e-learning? That's the conversation we have. Does your e-learning any good? Well, 72% of people completed it, so it's kind of okay. That's not very interesting. It's a proxy measure to get to the performance in the first place. What I am interested in, though, and what other people will become more interested in, is getting to measures like risk. So instead of measuring compliance, training, completions, can I measure risk? Instead of thinking about satisfaction or something like that, can I measure retention? And instead of thinking about doing a training needs analysis, which is a big thing in the corporate world, and it goes back to Neil's final point about learning design, can we anticipate the gaps and anticipate where our learning design can be improved? I see there's lots of crossover between my corporate world and the EdTech world, and there's lots that we can share from each other. And I'm really excited that the Vital project helped push us forward a little bit, and we invite everybody to come and download a bit of Learning Locker and have a go at contributing for yourself. It's lunch soon, so I better be quiet. But thank you ever so much for your time.